the sky over northern France was low and gray on November 7th, 1943. The kind of weather that swallowed both direction and confidence. Allied bombers had raided targets deep in occupied Europe that morning, and the skies were still thick with turbulence and lingering contrails. Somewhere above the cloud deck, a formation of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggled to navigate home. Among them flew Lieutenant William Roach, a young American pilot from the 358th Fighter Squadron, part of the 355th Fighter Group. The mission had gone wrong from the start. Poor visibility, faulty navigation, radio confusion. The group had become separated, fuel gauges sinking lower with every anxious minute. The English coast should have been ahead. Instead, the horizon revealed only unfamiliar terrain and the dim glint of water. To German eyes, the aircraft looked absurd. Its huge radial engine dominated the front, the fuselage bulged like a barrel, and its landing gear seemed built for a farm tractor rather than a fighter. Engineers smirked and muttered under their breath. A flying milk bottle, one joked, echoing the derisive nickname spreading among Luftwaffe circles. But beneath the jokes lay something else, curiosity. The Luftwaffe's technical branch, or Probungsstelle Wrestlen, had long been fascinated by captured Allied aircraft. Every detail was valuable: cockpit layouts, material quality, flight behavior, even fuel types. Within days, the Thunderbolt was repainted in German camouflage, given the code T9 plus FK, and flown under guard to the heart of Germany. At Rechlin, the plane would meet Hans-Werner Lursche, one of the most experienced test pilots in the Luftwaffe, a man who had flown everything from the nimble Bf-109 to captured Spitfires and flying fortresses. Lursche was known not just for his flying skills, but for his intellect and honesty. His reports were brutally objective, even when the truth displeased his superiors. He did not flatter German designs, nor did he underestimate Allied ones. On a cold November afternoon, Lursche walked across the Rechlin airfield toward the captured Thunderbolt. The aircraft looked massive, even ungainly, standing among the slender silhouettes of German fighters. Yet something about its presence commanded respect. Its construction looked solid, its rivets uniform, its skin clean and well-fitted, the mark of precise industrial craftsmanship. As Lursche circled the machine, clipboard in hand, he could not have known that this inspection would change the way he viewed engineering, and perhaps even war itself. The Thunderbolt was not a masterpiece of finesse, nor a record-breaker in speed or agility, but it was something Germany's finest engineers had failed to build, a weapon of endurance, designed not for heroes, but for an army, and soon, the man who had mocked its shape would discover its genius. When the captured Thunderbolt arrived at Rechlin, it caused more laughter than alarm. Technicians gathered around it, circling like mechanics inspecting a farm tractor that had somehow wandered onto a fighter base. Someone joked that it looked like a flying beer keg. Another muttered, "Typical Americans, all power, no finesse." Such comments weren't unusual. By late 1943, many within the Luftwaffe sincerely believed that German engineering was unmatched, that their fighters were masterpieces of precision and aerodynamic purity. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was sleek, agile, and deadly in the hands of an expert. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was rugged, fast, and responsive. By contrast, the P-47 seemed almost comical, too big, too heavy, too American. The arrogance wasn't just individual pride, it was systemic, rooted in the very culture of Nazi-era engineering. German design philosophy had long emphasized perfection through precision, the idea that technological superiority came from refinement, from building the ultimate machine for the ultimate pilot. In contrast, the Allies, especially the Americans, approached war as an industrial problem, not an artistic one. Their goal was not to craft a masterpiece, but to build thousands of reliable, effective tools that could be produced, maintained, and operated by ordinary men under brutal conditions. But to many German officers, that philosophy was proof of inferiority. "They build machines," one colonel sneered, "we build weapons." Hans-Werner Lursche understood this mindset all too well. He had seen it repeatedly in his years as a test pilot. When he reported that a British Spitfire outperformed a German fighter in certain conditions, superiors dismissed it as propaganda. When he praised the build quality of American engines, some accused him of defeatism. Lursche wasn't a political man, he was an engineer. He cared about how things worked, not about ideology. And he had learned to trust what the aircraft told him more than what the briefings said. When the Thunderbolt was wheeled into Rechlin's hangar, Lurch took the official intelligence dossier that came with it, a few pages describing it as a crude, overweight aircraft built for mass production, and quietly set it aside. He would make his own judgment. He began his examination the way he always did, walking slowly around the aircraft, studying every surface, every rivet line. What he saw began to trouble him. The panel gaps were even and consistent, the welds were clean, the materials high-grade, the internal structure robust yet standardized. This wasn't crude at all. It was precise but scalable. Lurch realized that the Americans had mastered something Germany was beginning to lose: industrial discipline. German aircraft production by late 1943 was being squeezed by shortages, bombings, and political interference. Factories were dispersed and undermanned. Parts from one batch often didn't fit another. Quality varied widely. Even the finest aircraft sometimes left the assembly line with flaws that would have been unthinkable before the war. By contrast, the P-47 in front of him showed consistency at scale. Every component looked like it had come from a process, not an artisan's bench. The Americans had built not a perfect airplane, but a repeatable one. As Lurch climbed onto the wing and looked down into the cockpit, he felt a faint unease. The space inside looked enormous compared to the cramped cockpits of German fighters. He could already imagine how his fellow test pilots would mock it. A lounge, not a cockpit, they would say. Yet something about it felt right, clean, organized, and human-centered. Standing there in the still, cold air of Richland, Lurch had no idea that his upcoming flight in this machine would change his understanding of engineering forever. The arrogance that had defined the Luftwaffe's design philosophy and much of Nazi Germany's technological worldview was about to meet a quiet, devastating truth. Hans Werner Lurch had been fascinated by flight long before the world around him turned to war. Born in Breslau in 1916, he grew up in an era when aviation was still young, daring, and romantic. Germany was forbidden to build military aircraft after the First World War, but the spirit of flight survived through gliding clubs scattered across the country. As a boy, Lurch spent weekends on grassy hillsides helping older enthusiasts assemble fragile wooden gliders, each launch a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Those experiences shaped him. Gliders taught precision, patience, and respect for the invisible language of air. Every gust, every thermal, every shift in balance mattered. Pilots who survived long enough to master gliders developed a sensitivity to flight that couldn't be taught in any classroom. By his late teens, Lurch was one of those pilots, calm, analytical, and fearless in the cockpit. When Hitler came to power in 1933 and Germany began secretly rebuilding its air force, talented young glider pilots like Lurch suddenly found opportunities opening everywhere. He joined the new Luftwaffe training program not because of ideology but because it offered him what he loved most: flight. By the time the war began in 1939, he had already gained a reputation as a pilot who could handle anything with wings. Unlike combat pilots who trained on one or two types of aircraft, Lurch's career took him to the Erprobungsstelle, Reiglin, the Luftwaffe's central flight test center, the German equivalent of Britain's Farnborough, or America's Wright Field. Reiglin was both laboratory and proving ground, a place where the country's most advanced designs and its most dangerous prototypes were tested. It was also where captured Allied aircraft were studied, measured, and when possible flown. For a pilot, Reiglin was both an honor and a death sentence. Test flying was far more dangerous than combat. New aircraft were unpredictable, often unstable, and frequently fatal. Yet Lurch thrived. He approached each flight like a scientist, not a daredevil. His calm demeanor, sharp technical mind, and near-perfect reflexes made him invaluable. Over time, his logbook filled with names that read like a museum of aviation history: Messerschmitt Bf-109, Focke-Wulf 190, Heinkel 111, Junkers 88, British Spitfires, Hurricanes, Soviet Yak-9s, American P-38 Lightnings, B-17 Flying Fortresses. By the war's end, he had flown more than 120 different aircraft types, an achievement unmatched by almost any other pilot of the era. His colleagues admired his skill, but also feared his honesty. Lurch's reports were brutally objective. When a German aircraft was unstable or mechanically unreliable, he said so. When an Allied design proved superior, he documented it in detail, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth was to his superiors. In an environment where ideology often mattered more than reality, Lurch's integrity made him both respected and dangerous. In 1943, that integrity was being tested more than ever. Germany's war machine was straining under the weight of attrition. Allied bombing raids hammered industrial centers. Factories were running out of materials, and trained mechanics were being replaced by forced laborers. The Luftwaffe's once elite pilot corps was thinning fast, replaced by young, undertrained recruits flying increasingly fragile machines. At Rechlin, Lurcha could see the decline with his own eyes. The aircraft arriving for testing showed more flaws with each passing month. Engines were inconsistent, spare parts didn't fit properly, fuel quality varied. The once flawless craftsmanship that defined German aviation was vanishing under the pressure of total war. That was the environment in which the captured P-47 Thunderbolt arrived. For the Luftwaffe, it was just another foreign machine to be studied and then forgotten. For Hans Werner Lurcha, it was something far more important, a mirror held up to everything that Germany's engineers believed about themselves. He studied the aircraft for hours before even climbing inside. To him, every rivet line, every hydraulic connection, every instrument placement told a story about the people who built it and the philosophy that guided them. The Thunderbolt did not look like an artist's creation. It looked like a tool, and that intrigued him. The Germans built aircraft for pilots who were expected to master them through years of training and discipline. The Americans, he began to suspect, had built this aircraft for pilots who simply needed to survive their first mission and then fly again the next day. It was a revolutionary thought, one that cut against everything the Luftwaffe believed about air combat. To most German engineers, that kind of thinking sounded like mediocrity. To Lurcha, it sounded like strategy. That night, sitting in his modest quarters at Rechlin, Lurcha wrote a few notes in his personal journal. He did not yet know what the aircraft would feel like in flight, but he could already sense that he was about to learn something uncomfortable. Not just about American engineering, but about Germany itself. "We build machines that demand excellence," he scribbled, "but war rewards endurance." The next morning, he would climb into the cockpit of the Thunderbolt for the first time, and once the engine roared to life, all the theories, assumptions, and arrogance surrounding German aviation would begin to unravel. The morning at Rechlin broke cold and silent. A thin fog clung to the airfield, muffling the sounds of distant engines and boots on concrete. Out on the tarmac, among sleek Messerschmitts and compact Focke-Wulfs, stood something that seemed almost out of place, a bulky, broad-shouldered aircraft painted in fresh Luftwaffe markings. The Americans had called it the P-47 Thunderbolt. German pilots, less kindly, called it Die fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. Hans Werner Lurcha paused a few meters from the machine. Even at rest, it dominated the space around it. The circular nose of its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine looked as large as a man. Its landing gear was thick, almost crude in appearance, and the whole fuselage seemed to bulge with metal and power. To German eyes trained to appreciate aerodynamic grace, it looked clumsy. To Lurcha, it looked purposeful. He began his inspection with his usual calm precision. Starting at the propeller, he moved slowly along the fuselage, tapping the skin, tracing the panel lines, and checking the fittings. What he saw contradicted everything he had read in the intelligence briefings. There was nothing crude about this aircraft. The panel gaps were exactly uniform, the rivets evenly spaced, the welds clean and strong. The finish wasn't elegant in the aesthetic sense, but it spoke of mass production done right, repeatable, disciplined, and consistent. Lurcha had spent years watching German quality decline under the pressures of total war. Factories bombed, materials replaced with substitutes, skilled craftsmen replaced by forced laborers. All of it left its mark. Even new Bf-109s sometimes arrived at Rechlin with uneven fittings or minor faults. The Thunderbolt showed none of that. Every inch of it suggested that the Americans had solved the problem Germany could not, building many aircraft that were all the same and all reliable. Climbing onto the wing, Lurcha looked into the cockpit. The first thing he noticed was space, an almost shocking amount of it. The seat was wide and padded, with plenty of legroom and excellent visibility. German fighters, especially the Bf-109, were cramped and uncomfortable. A tall pilot had to hunch forward to avoid hitting the canopy. The Thunderbolt felt different, designed not to constrain the pilot but to sustain him. Then he studied the instruments. At first glance, the layout looked simple, even unsophisticated, but the longer he looked, the more sense it made. Engine gauges were grouped together and clearly labeled. The dials were color-coded, green arcs for normal operation, red for danger, yellow for caution. It was intuitive. A pilot didn't need to memorize numbers, he could read the status of the engine at a glance. To an engineer like Lurcha, this was quietly revolutionary. In the Luftwaffe, instruments assumed expert knowledge and long experience. American engineers had approached the problem from the opposite direction: how to make a complex machine safe and usable for men who might have only a few hundred hours of total flight time. It wasn't mechanical genius, it was human-centered design. Moving through the rest of the cockpit, Lurch noticed the same pattern everywhere. The controls were logical and symmetrical. The throttle, propeller, and mixture levers were arranged side by side on the left console, allowing smooth one-handed operation. Switches were large enough to handle with gloves. The visibility from the bubble canopy was outstanding. Everything in this cockpit was there for a reason: to make flying easier, safer, and more repeatable. He checked the construction of the landing gear next. The struts were massive, with long shock absorbers and wide spacing. They looked capable of absorbing almost any landing. German fighters, by contrast, used narrow undercarriages that made takeoff and landing delicate, even for veterans. Many training accidents came not from enemy fire, but from ground loops and collapses. The Americans, Lurch realized, had eliminated that problem by accepting a little more weight in exchange for a lot more survivability. Everything pointed to a single guiding principle. This aircraft was designed to keep flying. It could be handled by pilots of uneven skill, maintained by mechanics in muddy field workshops, and survive rough landings or enemy fire, and still return to duty the next day. Lurch stepped back and looked at the Thunderbolt again. It was heavy, yes, and not beautiful in the traditional sense, but the more he studied it, the more he saw intelligence in its brute shape. The Germans built their fighters like sports cars, tuned to perfection but fragile. The Americans had built a truck with wings, and in a war that was grinding down every air force in Europe, a truck might be exactly what endurance demanded. As the mist lifted from the airfield, Lurch made a few quick notes in his book. Exceptional quality, intelligent cockpit layout, built for mass use, not mastery. He knew his next step was the real test, to see how the Thunderbolt behaved in the air. That would come tomorrow, and it would either confirm or destroy the impressions now forming in his mind. For the first time in a long while, Hans-Werner Lurch felt a flicker of professional excitement, not as a German, not as a soldier, but as a pilot and engineer standing before a machine that might teach him something new. The next day dawned clear and cold over Rechlin. The fog that had blanketed the airfield lifted slowly, revealing rows of aircraft, lined up like silent witnesses to the changing course of the war. Mechanics moved carefully around the captured P-47 Thunderbolt, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and preparing the American fighter for its first official test flight under German control. Hans-Werner Lurch arrived at the aircraft just after sunrise. He was calm, as always, his mind already focused on procedure. Test flights were not about excitement or risk, they were about observation, about reading the machine and understanding its logic. As he climbed into the cockpit, he noted again the unusual comfort. The seat supported his back properly, the pedals were well spaced, and the view from the canopy was wide and unobstructed. It felt more like sitting in the aircraft than wearing it, as German pilots often described the cramped Bf-109. He began the startup sequence, following the checklist printed on a small metal plate to his right. It was written in English, but the design was simple enough that he barely needed to translate. Switches were grouped logically, the fuel system controls clearly marked, and warning labels straightforward. Even without prior training, he could start the Thunderbolt with ease. When he pressed the starter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp came to life with a deep, even rumble. The sound was powerful but smooth, the entire aircraft vibrating with controlled strength. Lurch watched the gauges, oil pressure, temperature, manifold pressure, all rising neatly into the green zones. The color coding worked exactly as intended. A glance was enough to confirm that everything was running correctly. He smiled slightly. This cockpit thinks for the pilot, he thought. German fighters, by comparison, required constant attention. Their gauges were precise, but demanded deep familiarity. A pilot needed to memorize numbers, manage mixtures manually, and monitor temperature margins closely. The Thunderbolt system reduced that mental load. It allowed the pilot to focus on flying and surviving, not on constant calculations. Taxiing to the runway, Lurch felt another surprise. The wide landing gear gave the Thunderbolt excellent stability on the ground. far superior to the narrow, delicate legs of a Bf-109. Visibility during taxi was good, and the tail wheel, which could lock in place, kept the aircraft tracking straight. This small feature alone could save dozens of aircraft from unnecessary accidents. He lined up on the runway, advanced the throttle, and felt the aircraft surge forward. The acceleration was strong, steady, and controlled. There was no sudden swing, no instability. The tail lifted smoothly, and moments later, the massive fighter lifted off the ground. When the hangar doors closed behind the Thunderbolt, Hans-Werner Lursche walked straight to his small office beside the flight line. His notebook was already open on the desk. The test flight had gone perfectly, yet what stayed in his mind wasn't performance figures or turn rates. It was the feeling of dependability, the sense that nothing in the P-47 had been left to chance. He began to write while the impressions were still fresh. The engine had run with a steadiness he rarely felt in German machines. No vibration, no erratic temperature swings. The R-2800 Double Wasp had delivered constant power through every maneuver. German engines, especially the Daimler-Benz series, were more refined on paper but increasingly fragile in practice. Even a minor production flaw or field repair could ruin their precision. The American engine, by contrast, seemed built to tolerate rough treatment and still perform. Lursche considered the meaning of that difference. German aircraft were designed like instruments, precise, elegant, but unforgiving. The Thunderbolt was designed like a tool, rugged, simple to operate, and almost impossible to mishandle. Where German engineers trusted perfect craftsmanship, American engineers trusted standardization. They accepted a little inefficiency in exchange for consistency. He flipped to a fresh page and drew two columns, performance and operations. Under performance, he listed the usual metrics: climb rate, top speed, turn radius. Under operations, he wrote the things that mattered in real war: engine reliability, maintenance time, pilot fatigue, accident rate, repairability. For the first time, he realized the second list was the one that truly decided who won battles in the air. Later that afternoon, he returned to the aircraft for a closer systems inspection. The fuel controls, he noticed, were labeled so clearly that even a tired or inexperienced pilot couldn't confuse them. Hydraulic lines were accessible for quick repairs. The electrical system was neatly organized and easy to trace. Everywhere he looked, he saw logic aimed at reducing errors. In the Luftwaffe, the assumption had always been that a well-trained pilot and expert mechanic would handle complexity. But by 1943, that assumption no longer held. The Luftwaffe's training program was collapsing under fuel shortages. New pilots were being rushed into combat with barely enough hours to master takeoffs and landings. The P-47, Lursche realized, was designed for that reality, for a war fought by thousands of average men, not hundreds of elites. He remembered how forgiving the Thunderbolt had been during landing. Even when he forgot to lock the tail wheel at one point, the aircraft corrected easily. In a Bf-109, that mistake could have wrecked the plane. The Americans had built margin into their machines, margin for human error, for fatigue, for stress. That idea, engineering for endurance rather than perfection, fascinated him. It was something German aviation philosophy had never truly embraced. German designers competed for elegance and records. American designers built for results. As evening fell over Rechlin, Lursche stood outside the hangar, watching the sun reflect off the Thunderbolt's broad wings. The aircraft looked heavy and unrefined. But he no longer saw it that way. What he saw now was resilience, given form, metal shaped by a philosophy of war that Germany, for all its brilliance, had never learned. He wrote one final line in his log before leaving for the night: "We seek mastery, they seek momentum, and momentum will outlast mastery." In the air, the Thunderbolt felt different from any German aircraft he had flown. It was heavy, yes, but also stable and forgiving. Control inputs were smooth and predictable. It didn't respond sharply like a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf, but it didn't punish mistakes either. It seemed built to make flying easier, to protect the pilot from himself. At altitude, Lursche tested the controls: gentle turns, climbs, dives. Everything worked as expected, without quirks or surprises. The engine remained steady, the instruments clear. For a pilot who had flown unstable prototypes and temperamental machines, this kind of reliability was astonishing. As he leveled out and watched the sun glint off the Thunderbolt's broad wings, a realization formed clearly in his mind.
This aircraft wasn't designed for aces. It was designed for armies. It didn't demand skill. It supported it. It didn't challenge the pilot. It enabled him. In the cockpit of this flying jug, Lurche saw the essence of America's industrial philosophy, not to build the perfect machine, but to build one that any pilot could fight in and return home with. That practicality, he realized, was far more dangerous than elegance. After nearly 90 minutes in the air, he brought the P-47 back to Rechlin. The landing was simple, stable, and soft, the shock absorbers absorbing the impact easily. When he shut down the engine, a small crowd of ground crewmen approached, waiting for his verdict. Lurche climbed down from the cockpit, pulled off his gloves, and looked once more at the massive aircraft. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "It's not beautiful, but it's brilliant."
Night had settled over Rechlin when Hans Werner Lurche returned to his office to write the report. The air outside was cold and still. The sound of engines long faded. Inside, only the yellow light of his desk lamp broke the darkness. Before him lay a blank form marked Geheime Kommandosache, top secret. He knew what he needed to write, but he also knew what it would mean. In the Luftwaffe of 1943, honesty was often dangerous. Yet Lurche had never written anything but the truth. He began methodically, as always, describing the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt in purely technical terms. It was, he noted, powerful at high altitude and slower at low levels. Its turbo supercharger gave it strength above 15,000 feet, allowing it to maintain speed where German fighters began to struggle. The aircraft's handling was stable and predictable, its landing gear strong and forgiving. He described the engine as smooth and reliable, the instruments clear, the cockpit remarkably comfortable. It was a factual summary, but it did not explain what truly mattered, not yet. Lurche paused, staring at the empty space below the technical sections, and then began the paragraph that would define his entire assessment. He wrote that the P-47 represented a fundamentally different philosophy of design. German aircraft, he explained, were built for performance, for expert pilots and precise maintenance. The P-47 was built for reliability, for pilots of average experience, and for mechanics working in field conditions. Where German engineering pursued perfection, American engineering pursued endurance. The Thunderbolt, he wrote, was not a masterpiece of finesse, but a masterpiece of practicality, a machine built not for records, but for war. He described how every element of the American design served the goal of operational availability. The cockpit was arranged for clarity and comfort to reduce pilot fatigue. The wide landing gear made ground handling safe and easy. The instruments, with their color-coded markings, allowed instant understanding. The engine tolerated rough use. The structure absorbed damage. This was not crude workmanship, as German propaganda claimed. It was industrial intelligence, shaped by a nation that understood the scale and rhythm of total war. As he wrote, Lurche thought of the factories he had visited in Germany. The shortage of materials, the lack of skilled workers, the constant interruptions from Allied bombers. He knew that German aircraft production was already strained, that many new fighters arrived at the front mechanically unreliable or poorly finished. The Americans, by contrast, could build thousands of Thunderbolts identical in quality, supported by an endless flow of parts and fuel. The conclusion was obvious, and to him, inescapable. His final section, titled Strategische Bewertung, Strategic Assessment, contained the lines that would later be remembered. The Americans have not built the best fighter. They have built the most operational fighter. They design for endurance and availability. In total war, that difference decides victory. He signed the report with his usual precision, folded it neatly, and sent it through official channels the following morning. Within a week it reached Berlin. There, in the technical office of the Luftwaffe, a few officers read it, commented briefly, and filed it away. The conclusion was considered pessimistic and not in line with the spirit of German engineering. The official summary that accompanied the document described the Thunderbolt as a heavy, crude aircraft, typical of American over-engineering. No further action was taken. For Lurche, this outcome was no surprise. He had seen the same pattern before. Reports that praised Allied aircraft or suggested German weakness were always ignored or quietly buried. The leadership preferred confidence over correction, ideology over evidence. Yet this time, the stakes were far greater. Lurche's report was not just a technical critique. It was a warning. It stated, in clear and reasoned words, that Germany was fighting an enemy it could not outproduce. and that its own engineering philosophy was unsuited to the kind of war it now faced. Weeks later, as new Allied raids struck deeper into the Reich, the truth of his words began to appear in the skies. Waves of P-47s flew escort for American bombers, returning day after day in numbers that seemed endless. Even when some were shot down, more arrived to take their place. German pilots reported that the Thunderbolts were difficult to destroy and often returned home with damage that would have doomed a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and struggling to keep its aircraft serviceable, began to feel the weight of the imbalance Lurky had tried to describe. He continued his work at Rechlin, testing new aircraft and captured machines, writing more reports, and flying as carefully as ever. But he knew, deep down, that his report on the Thunderbolt would be remembered, not because it had changed anything, but because it had predicted exactly what was to come. Germany had built brilliant machines that could not be sustained. America had built simple machines that never stopped flying, and in a war of exhaustion, that difference would prove fatal. That night, as he looked out across the dark runway, the hangars silent behind him, Lurch reflected on the machine he had tested. The Americans had built a fighter for ordinary men, not for heroes. In that choice lay their strength. He turned off the lamp, closed the office door, and walked into the cold air, unaware that his quiet words would one day stand as one of the clearest explanations of why the Luftwaffe lost the war in the air. By the spring of 1944, the truth of Hans Werner Lurch's report was no longer theoretical. It was written in the sky. Day after day, the drone of American engines rolled across northern Germany. The air war had changed. The Luftwaffe, once the proud guardian of the Reich's airspace, was now fighting for survival. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become a familiar shape over the countryside, massive, loud, and relentless. They came in formations that stretched across the horizon, each fighter a small piece of a vast industrial wave. They escorted bombers deep into the heart of Germany, attacked airfields, railways, and fuel depots, and then returned the next morning to do it again. The same aircraft, the same markings, the same confident hum of radial engines. It seemed to the men on the ground that there was no end to them. German pilots, exhausted and undertrained, noticed what Lurch had written months before. The Thunderbolts could take astonishing punishment. Shells that would have torn a Messerschmitt apart merely scarred their armor. Pilots watched in disbelief as damaged P-47s, engines smoking, still climbed away from combat and headed west. They called them flying tanks. The insult from earlier months had become a grim acknowledgement of fact. At the same time, the Luftwaffe's strength was collapsing. Allied bombers struck aircraft factories almost daily. Fuel supplies dwindled to a fraction of what they had been. New aircraft left assembly lines with defects caused by poor materials or rushed labor. Pilots were sent into combat with barely a dozen hours of flight training. On paper, Germany still produced impressive numbers of fighters. In practice, fewer and fewer could actually take off. The contrast could not have been clearer. An American fighter group with 100 Thunderbolts might have 80 or 90 available for a mission. A German squadron with the same number of aircraft could field barely half that number. The rest waited for spare parts that never arrived or engines that had failed prematurely. The balance that Lurch had described in his report, the difference between performance and availability, now defined the entire war in the air. At Rechlin, Lurch continued his work, testing new machines that were supposed to restore the Luftwaffe's advantage. Some were brilliant in concept, jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 and rocket-powered interceptors like the Me-163, but they came too late and in too few numbers. The factories that built them were under constant attack, skilled workers were gone, fuel for testing and training was nearly exhausted. These revolutionary aircraft could not compensate for the thousands of durable, dependable Thunderbolts and Mustangs filling the skies. When Lurch flew over central Germany in late 1944, he saw the destruction from above, bombed cities, shattered rail lines, silent airfields. He also saw the endless trails of contrails stretching west to east and back again. American formations flew with mechanical precision, supported by a logistics system that seemed inexhaustible. The Luftwaffe still fought bravely, but courage was no substitute for endurance. For Lurch, every new report he wrote confirmed the same truth he had already stated. Germany's problem was not a lack of talent or innovation. It was a failure to design and produce for sustainability. The enemy had built an air force that could lose aircraft today and replace them tomorrow. while Germany could not even guarantee fuel for training flights. In total war, that imbalance was fatal. By early 1945, the skies above the Reich belonged to the Allies. The once dominant Luftwaffe existed mostly on paper. Airfields stood full of grounded aircraft without fuel, while above them, Thunderbolts and Mustangs patrolled freely. Lurch kept flying captured machines and prototypes until the very last weeks, recording data that few would ever read. When the war finally ended, he survived, one of the few Luftwaffe test pilots to do so. Allied officers who later questioned him were struck by his clarity and lack of bitterness. He told them that American aircraft were not better because they were faster or more agile, but because they were designed to endure. The P-47, he explained, had shown him what industrial war really meant: reliability, standardization, and the ability to fight without rest. Everything he had written in 1943 had come true. The Germans had built fighters for excellence, the Americans had built fighters for persistence, and in the end, it was persistence that filled the skies. By the last months of 1944, the Luftwaffe's struggle had become a slow, inevitable collapse. Its airfields were full of machines that looked magnificent, but could no longer fight. Gleaming Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs stood lined up on cracked concrete, their engines silent, their fuel tanks empty. Nearby, young pilots in worn leather jackets waited for orders that never came. The war that had once been a contest of skill and courage had become a war of attrition, and Germany had no strength left to trade. The roots of that failure reached far deeper than the bombing of factories or the shortage of oil. They lay in a mindset, an engineering culture that valued perfection over practicality. From the beginning, the Luftwaffe had pursued technical brilliance with almost artistic pride. Every new fighter was meant to be faster, lighter, more precise than the one before it. Each part was designed to exact tolerances, each system optimized for the hands of an expert pilot. It was a vision of flying as craftsmanship, of warfare as a test of mastery. In the early years, that philosophy had worked. In 1939 and 1940, German aircraft outclassed most of their opponents. The Bf-109 was elegant, powerful, and deadly in experienced hands. The FW-19 introduced a new level of agility and firepower. German aces dominated the skies over Europe. But the longer the war dragged on, the more that perfection turned into a trap. The Luftwaffe's fighters required constant maintenance and expert handling. They were built to exacting standards that mass production could not sustain under pressure. Hans-Werner Lurch saw this clearly from Rechlin. He flew the prototypes, the production models, and the captured enemy machines. He saw how much time and effort it took to keep a German fighter operational, and how easily an American or British one could be repaired and returned to the air. Every report he filed confirmed the same truth. Germany's aircraft were technically impressive, but strategically fragile. In contrast, the Allies, especially the Americans, had accepted imperfection as part of their strength. They built aircraft to be good enough, not flawless. They valued simplicity, reliability, and volume. A single Thunderbolt might not match a Messerschmitt in agility, but 10 Thunderbolts flying every day were worth more than 3 Messerschmitts grounded for repairs. The Allies had embraced industrial war, while Germany was still fighting an engineers' war. Inside Germany, this lesson went largely unlearned. Even as production fell and resources vanished, new designs kept pushing for sophistication rather than simplicity. The jet-powered Me-262, one of the most advanced aircraft ever built, arrived too late to matter. Its engines were fast but short-lived. Its maintenance demands were beyond what the Luftwaffe could supply. It was the perfect example of brilliance without sustainability, a symbol of how far the Reich had strayed from the practical realities of war. Lurch continued to test such machines with the same precision he had always shown, but his reports grew more somber. He noted that advanced aircraft were useless without trained pilots, fuel, and maintenance. The Luftwaffe, once the model of efficiency, now relied on hastily trained boys sent into impossible missions. They flew beautifully designed aircraft into battles they had no chance to win. By early 1945, Lurch's old colleagues had either fallen in combat or been reassigned. Rechlin itself was increasingly silent, its test flights limited by fuel rationing. He often walked along the runway and looked at the rows of aircraft that would never fly again. Each one represented a triumph of design and a failure of strategy. Germany's engineers had built masterpieces for a world that no longer existed. When the end came, it was not sudden but steady, a quiet fading of what had once seemed unbreakable. The Luftwaffe, crippled by shortages and overcomplexity, was defeated not only by the Allies' numbers, but by its own ideals. The pursuit of perfection had consumed the capacity for endurance. After the war, when Lurch spoke to Allied officers, he expressed this thought with characteristic simplicity. "We built the best aircraft in the world," he said, "but the Americans built the best aircraft for war." It was the same truth he had recognized in the cockpit of the P-47 2 years earlier. The price of perfection, he understood, was defeat in a world where survival mattered more than elegance. As Germany lay in ruins, the skies above were filled not with Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, but with the steady drone of Allied aircraft, engines that kept running, wings that kept flying. The lesson was unmistakable. In the end, it was not the perfection of machines that determined victory, but the endurance of those who could keep them in the air. When the war finally ended, the silence that settled over Germany was almost unbearable. The once mighty Luftwaffe existed only on paper, its airfields filled with wreckage and empty fuel drums. The pilots who had survived captivity returned to a homeland in ruins. Among them was Hans Werner Larke, the man who had tested more aircraft than almost anyone alive, and who had seen, years earlier, exactly how the war would be lost. He was taken into Allied custody, not as a criminal, but as a man of knowledge. American and British intelligence officers questioned him about his flights, his reports, and his impressions of captured aircraft. They had already found his files at Rechlin, the neat, precise pages describing the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Mustang, the Spitfire. One officer asked him, almost with curiosity, why he had written that American aircraft were superior in operational design. Lurch answered quietly, because it was the truth. He explained that the difference between German and American engineering was not a matter of talent, but of purpose. German engineers had sought perfection. American engineers had sought reliability. The Thunderbolt, he said, had been designed not for the best pilot in the world, but for the ordinary one, a man who might be tired, cold, or frightened, yet could still start the engine, fly the mission, and come home. That, he told them, is how you win a war. The Allied officers listened closely. Many of them had flown those same Thunderbolts over Germany and knew exactly what he meant. Their aircraft had not been glamorous. They were heavy, often dirty, and far from elegant. But they had flown day after day, through snow and flak and fatigue, always enough of them to continue the fight. After his release, Lurch lived quietly. He wrote his memoirs, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, recording in calm technical language what he had learned from flying more than 120 different aircraft. His tone was never bitter. He admired the genius of German designers, but acknowledged their failure to adapt to the demands of total war. He described the P-47 with respect, as a machine that embodied a philosophy his own country had never fully understood. In his later years, when asked what the experience had taught him, Lurch always returned to the same idea, that engineering is a reflection of how a nation thinks about people. Germany had built fighters that demanded flawless pilots. America had built fighters that supported imperfect ones. The difference was moral as much as mechanical. One trusted the individual's skill, the other trusted the system's strength. The legacy of that contrast extended far beyond the war. In the decades that followed, aviation design, both military and civilian, increasingly adopted the principles that Lurch had admired in the P-47: standardization, human-centered control layouts, and simplicity in maintenance. The belief that machines should serve people, not the other way around, became a cornerstone of modern engineering. Looking back, historians would come to see the P-47 not as the best fighter of the Second World War, but perhaps the best designed for the kind of war that was actually fought, a war of factories, logistics, and endurance. Its power lay not in agility or grace, but in its reliability, its toughness, and its ability to return home again and again. In that way, it was more than a weapon. It was a lesson in what it takes to survive. For Hans Werner Lurch, that lesson was personal. He had risked his life testing the enemy's machines, and had been ignored for telling the truth about them. Yet in the end, history proved him right. The skies over Europe were filled with the very aircraft he had once defended in his report, and their steady engines carried a message that outlasted the war itself, that endurance defeats brilliance, and that reliability is a quieter kind of strength. When he died in 2003, at the age of 87, he left behind not only a record of extraordinary flights, but also an insight as enduring as any design he tested. In war, as in life, It is not the perfect that prevails, but the resilient, those who can keep flying when everything around them is falling apart.